Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank all of you for your work and for being here. I think this has been very useful. I did want to point out that Walt Kelly's great quote that you is my father's favorite cartoon, Pogo. But that was on the reason that's so famous in 1970, he put that on an environmental poster. And he was really talking about the causes of pollution and environmental challenges that we created. He also, what was the other one we had here? Having lost sight of our objectives, we redoubled our efforts, which is something that this committee has to be very careful of. Also, he said that we are faced with insurmountable opportunities. I mean, could go down the long list. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Mr. Asthana, I saw in your testimony that PJM is over 250,000 megawatts. It's been brought up a couple different times as we discuss. The PJM's recent analysis identified several concerning trends that could result in a capacity shortfall, as you recognize. You also considered different scenarios regarding how quickly we could bring on new generation. You could bring on new generation. Can you talk a little bit about the high new entry scenario in which you're able to get a lot of generation out of interconnection queues and onto the grid? How does that impact the risk of blackouts and future interruptions?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Great question. So we have said we see 40,000 megawatts at risk of retiring by 2030. To replace it, we need 100,000 megawatts of the intermittent generation. We have 250,000 in the queue, so it's doable, right? Our interconnection reform will move that generation through the queue in time to get built. The problem is the completion rates of those projects are really low. So we're going to need to get 50, 60% completion rates when we're seeing 5 to 10% because of issues like supply chain constraints, permitting, and the like. So it's doable, but I wouldn't want to bet the farm that it will be done given the current trends. I think we need to push to get it done, but I think we need to not burn the boats in terms of the generation that we have in the meanwhile.
Right, thank you. As Senator King pointed out, and you've all pointed out, that the pressure that's coming to make these changes more rapidly really is coming from the public. I mean, the EPA in many regards is feeling that pressure, which is the occurrence of extreme weather. I remember, I've got my master's now, it's almost 50 years old, but in earth and environmental science, and you go back, and back then we called it the greenhouse effect, but as early as the mid to late 1980s, we began predicting extreme weather was going to be a consequence of climate change as we saw it. When I first became mayor of Denver in 2003, we had some of the worst wildfires we'd ever had. They've only gotten worse continuously in a cycle. The question I have for each of you, if we're going to do this properly and measure, as Senator King was describing, how do we balance reliability with the urgency to address climate change before the extreme weather accelerates to a point where we really can't deal with it, which is not impossible to imagine? Do you think a price on carbon helps us assess, creates a system where we can assess these competing urgencies that I think we're all faced with right now? Why don't we start with you, Mr. Tudor, and we can go right down the list.
Well, selfishly, I don't want to pay any more taxes.
Well, if the money was all given back as a dividend.
Sure, I understand. In the past, tradable markets have had a positive effect on the reduction of emissions.
Great.
They have, yes, sir.
Dr. Lott?
So one of my colleagues at the Center on Global Energy Policy, Dr. Noah Kaufman, works on this quite a bit. Putting a price on these things, as you say, has succeeded in the past when it comes to addressing things like acid rain, and it is one tool that can be deployed.
Yeah, and I don't underestimate the complexity of getting to doing this in a way that would be perceived as fair and just. Mr. Asthana?
Yes, I do think a price on carbon can get us to a more efficient solution to carbon mitigation.
Great.
As NERC, I don't think we have a point of view on that.
Yeah, it has become a more political problem probably than it needs to be or should be. And it certainly was generated by Republicans and Democrats, but I keep circling back because so many people in Congress have given up on it. And it is the one sure way to avoid, to find out a solution whereby government gets their finger off the scale, and where we let some of these systems that we all recognize are complex but important, that allow the system to generate its own priorities. Mr. Jeter.
I would prefer that to the latest EPA rule on 111B and D. And because what that does is exactly what you're saying, is it forces things into unintended consequences. I'd much rather have a market to cause that versus unintended consequences of set rules that will require retirements.
No, I understand that, and I appreciate what Dr. Lott said in terms of, as we look at revisiting the processes that we use to look at that type of rulemaking, how do we make sure we can maintain the transparency? We can accelerate the time, but we've got to make sure we protect the role of the public in having an opportunity to discuss their own future as well. Yield back to the ranking member.